tell us what your name is and how you are connected to Huddersfield Town.
Yeah, my name's Clem Stephenson. I'm the grandson of Clem Stephenson that was captain and then manager of Huddersfield Town.
And do you have any memories of your grandfather?
Memories of him are, as an ordinary guy, smiled a lot, used to go on walks. He used to take me on walks to Castle Hill, and he always had an apple in his pocket, so he used to peel that and take slices off it. He was just an ordinary guy. And then on the other side, I remember him and me dad taking me to the racecourse. And whilst we were there, this big guy came up with blonde hair, and I recognised him, and he came up to talk to me granddad. And it was Dave Hickson, who played centre forward for Town for a couple of seasons and scored quite a few goals, and then he played for Liverpool and Everton. And another occasion I remember when I was very, very young, my granddad took a phone call, and it was a friend of his, and he just handed me the phone and said hello to this gentleman. And it was Sir Gordon Richards, who was one of the greatest ever jockeys, 26 times champion jockey, on the phone. That's the other side of him, you know. He liked his billiards. He was a very good billiards player, and he liked his bowls. We were always around the bowling green, just watching sometimes. Yeah, I remember those days. I spent a lot of time with him until he went. Yeah, those were the memories that stand out. Oh, and there was one other memory, and it must be the earliest memory I can remember. We were in the garden, me, my granddad, my dad, and we were playing football with a tennis ball. And I must have only been 4 or 5. And he nutmegged me. And I went, "You bugger." And that's what that was one of his phrases. I heard him say with Geordie, "Oh, you bugger, man." And everybody laughed. Yeah, so those are memories.
Huddersfield Town, founded in 1908, obviously in the centre of a real rugby league stronghold. Football was coming to the fore in the West Riding round about that time. A lot of activity in places like Bradford and Leeds. Huddersfield seemed to want to get in on the act. There was quite a few local football clubs and certainly an interest in people playing the game. You saw the formation of the Huddersfield Football Association, which of course still exists, in the late 1890s. And I think, you know, people in Huddersfield saw what was happening in Bradford, where Bradford City and Bradford Park Avenue had both emerged as quite strong clubs, having previously been rugby league clubs, funnily enough, wanting to get in on the act, and decided that they wanted to form a professional football club to represent Huddersfield. Probably took 2 or 3 years from what we can tell, starting, you know, around about sort of 1905, 1906. And by 1908, they were in a position to launch the club as a professional entity and get going. And clearly ambitious from the start. They wanted to get into the Football League. They started off playing in the North Eastern League, then went into the Midland League because there was a proliferation of various non-leagues at that time. Eventually got into the Football League in 1910, so progress was pretty swift, really. You look back at Town's early years, so the first sort of 12 years of existence, it was pretty checkered, really, very up and down. There was a couple of financial crises, obviously the major one coming in 1919, but there had been one previously where the club had gone close to going into liquidation. You know, Fartown, which wasn't too far away, obviously just over the road, really, from Leeds Road. A really good team historically, and also, you know, the team of all talents which existed 1914-15. You know, so they were one of the best teams in rugby league. So there was a lot of competition primarily for supporters, and obviously supporters through the gate were crucial to developing the club, you know, both in terms of interest and finance. So yeah, a difficult first sort of decade of existence for Huddersfield Town.
Leeds City had been wound up over some irregularities during the war. They were making payments to players which wasn't allowed, and amongst other things. And so then Leeds were without a club. So the Crowthers were then looking at moving the club to what would become Leeds United, and it took a real fundraising campaign. I think it's often talked about as one of the earliest examples of sort of fan activism. They had they were going door to door, they were getting the buckets out, and they had to raise £25,000 to save the club in just they only had a few weeks to do it, a few months to do it. They managed to get it down to 17,500, which Crowther then took off and used to put into Leeds United. But this was sort of rumbling on just as they were doing really well in Division 2 and looking at getting into the top flight for the first time. So that season in 1919-1920, they were also on an FA Cup run. They got all the way to the final, where they played Aston Villa, who had won it 5 times previously. And Town were a Division 2 side back then. So I think to modern ears, it sounds like, you know, a second tier club making it to the FA Cup final isn't unheard of, but it's something that only happens now and then. I think the gap between the divisions was less then than it is now, of course. And there's some reports now, I don't know how accurate they are, suggesting that Town were going into that game sort of being fancied by some people because they'd been on that roll in Division 2, that they'd had a real galvanising effect from that fundraiser they'd had, and they'd had some excellent attendances. That cup run was massive for Town in helping drive the attendances up. There's reports that they had 35,000 when Plymouth Argyle came, and Plymouth had actually petitioned that game should either be played in Plymouth or in Leeds because they were worried about whether the attendances would be there. Of course, they didn't need to worry in the end. Massive attendance, even bigger against Liverpool as well in the following round. So there's a real sort of wave of momentum behind Town, and this was sort of the start of them being a popular club and being something that people in the town would really rally behind rather than sort of a niche pursuit as it had been before.
Going into the 21-22 season, Town had struggled. They'd been promoted in 1920, so obviously they had to adapt to life in the top division, and there was quite a big jump, just as there is now. There was still a big jump in those days, maybe not quite as big, but still quite significant. They'd finished 17th in the first division in that first season, not had a particularly good FA Cup run, so I don't think hopes would have been high that they could repeat that 1920 success. It was probably seen as a bit of a one-off, and it'd be something like Town getting to the FA Cup final these days, I think, if they'd done it in 1922.
So when you're looking at key players, the first player really to stand out for me is Alex Sandy-Much, the goalkeeper. A really big, commanding figure in the goal. Only 6 foot tall, but I think 6 foot for that 1922 was rather tall. He came down from Aberdeen in 1910 for Huddersfield's first league season. And he was a real constant figure throughout that period, unfortunately broken up by the First World War. But Alex Sandy-Much's final season as well was 1922. And you know, one of his final hurrahs was at Stamford Bridge for the FA Cup final. And as a player who played over 200 games for the club, I think it was a really good fitting farewell that he went out with the FA Cup final and later the Charity Shield. And Sammy Wadsworth as well, just in front of Alex Sandy-Much. Wadsworth was a left fullback. Interestingly as well, just prior to the FA Cup final, a couple of weeks earlier, him and Billy Smith both received the first England calls. And it really shows the quality that Sammy Wadsworth had, that he was being called up to the England squad at that time. And up front was a real character called Ernie Islip, and when you watch back the final whistle videos from the 90s, you can see a real reverence, if you like, from Jim Pearce, who talks about Ernie Islip, and you can tell that he was a real crowd favourite, a really aggressive forward who used to get stuck into the defenders, and he also scored a couple of goals as well, so he was a really important figure for Huddersfield Town.
The 1921-22 team contained, you know, lots of solid players, and if you look back, look forward to when they went on to great league success, you can certainly see the nucleus of the team which was being assembled. the ones that obviously stand out, Tommy Wilson, who was the captain, a really solid centre-back, and Billy Smith on the left wing. Obviously, you know, crucially in those days, wingers were a big part of the way football was played. So he was a real key component of that side.
Billy Smith, the man from Tantoby. Billy Smith, obviously he missed the 1920 FA Cup final through suspension. So I'd imagine he would have really had this sort of bit between his teeth. And he was a real crowd favourite, Billy Smith. From what we can see, he was a real direct runner, he was quick, two-footed, excellent crosser of the ball. And when you read the reports on him, he apparently scored quite a phenomenal amount of goals as well for an outside left. And he was a player that, you know, came to Huddersfield in 1913 as an 18-year-old. And it's really wonderful to see his career as a one-club man go through, you know, almost a full 20 years at the club. Billy Smith is not just important to the 1922 FA Cup winning side. Billy Smith's very important to the absolute history of Huddersfield Town Football Club. Billy Smith set standards and records that, you know, haven't been surpassed in the past 100 years. You know, 574 appearances, 126 goals shows what a phenomenal player Billy Smith was and how important he was to Huddersfield Town Football Club.
Clem Stephenson, obviously another you know, key player, very experienced player, probably seen as, when he arrived at Huddersfield Town from Aston Villa, as maybe being a little bit past his best, but certainly proved to be a fantastic acquisition for the club, and, you know, a great controller of the game. I think his talent, as much as his playing ability, was in his ability to read the game and to control things from that sort of crucial midfield position.
When Clem got here, I think it was important because Town had a youngish side and they needed a general. And I think with his experience and his winning mentality, that would have rubbed off, as it does even today, when an experienced player comes in and the youngsters see how he trains and how he manages his life and the game, they learn a lot. And I think that's what happened. It looked, when he got here, there was the makings of a good side, and they just needed a midfield general, a playmaker, and that's what he was, because he'd lost his pace. He had pace when he was younger. He wasn't frightened. From what I've read, he wasn't frightened of anybody on the pitch. He'd give as good as he got. He could kick with both feet. His passes were written about and said they were as sweet as a stolen kiss. That's how the journalists put it those days. So yeah, it must have been some player worth a fortune today. I've got a piece of paper and it's written about Huddersfield Town. And it says they were stubborn, disciplined and highly mobile, with Clem Stephenson at the heart of everything. And I think that's what Herbert Chapman wanted.
Herbert Chapman, you know, obviously absolutely essential to the success of Huddersfield Town. You know, you can never lay all these things at the door of one person, but, you know, you look at the way he came in, controlled the club, started to exert his influence, his ideas, such an innovative manager, you know, absolutely crucial to things going forward.
Herbert Chapman had been brought in as Ambrose Langley's assistant, but I think it was pretty clear that he wasn't really intended to be an assistant. He'd been suspended by the FA for his part in Leeds City's downfall. He refused to turn over the books when the FA came knocking for them, and he'd taken a job in Selby at a coke factory, a coke and oil factory. But I think there was a feeling at the time that life ban didn't really mean life. It was sort of a life ban, and Huddersfield appealed on his behalf so that he could come back into the game because they wanted him to come in as Langley's assistant. Chesterfield also offered him a job. There were other offers for Chapman on the table, but he was encouraged by the fact that Huddersfield had been the ones who moved first for him, even though he was suspended. And although he came in as an assistant, it was an assistant in name only, really. He was earning almost twice as much as Langley, and he was the one that was talking to the directors, which Langley didn't particularly like, and he ended up they ended up paying him off to go and open a pub in Sheffield instead, basically, so that Chapman could take the reins, because he'd already made a bit of a name for himself at Northampton and at Leeds City. He was a real innovator. You know, he's always talked about as the first of the modern managers in English football. He collaborated with likes of Meisel and Jimmy Hogan, who were very important in the Austrian super team of the 1930s. So he was up there tactically. He wanted his players to talk about tactics and strategy and ways to win the game, which was almost unheard of at the time. There's some claims that he's the first manager to introduce team talks. You wonder what they were doing before then, but yeah, he apparently saw the players arguing vociferously over a game of cards once and was like, oh, there's something in this, we'll do team talks. He even picked the records that they played at Leeds Road over the gramophone, apparently. So, you know, he was a fitness fanatic as well, or at least for the time he was, probably by today's standards, not so much. But, you know, he wanted his players playing golf. He wanted them to be active. The other big thing for Herbert Chapman was he felt that he should be the one picking the team, which sounds strange to modern ears to think, of course the manager picks the team, but then the board of directors were picking it and they'd pick it several days before the game. You know, he went to the directors and said, I want to pick the team, which sort of is a bit of a sign of the times. But the success he had both at Huddersfield and then later at Arsenal speaks to the fact that he was perhaps the greatest pre-war manager in England. Herbert Chapman's tactics were quite innovative. There's sort of conflicting reports about how much he liked wingers, but at the time everything went through the wingers. They were the creative forces of any team, as they sort of remain today. But Chapman liked low passing football. There were sort of two schools of thought: the English long ball and the Scottish passing style, and he preferred the passing style. Jonathan Wilson talked in Inverting the Pyramid about how he liked things to go through the middle rather than going out wide. He didn't particularly like crossing, according to Wilson, but there's other reports that from the time that suggest he was, you know, Billy Smith was a great crosser of the ball. And I think there's probably a degree of pragmatism to what he did, and that's pragmatism in the true sense, not in the defensive sense, although there was that as well, where if the conditions allowed him to play that low passing game, he would do it. But if, you know, obviously all the pitches were pretty dreadful at the time, but if they were, you know, if it was blowing a gale and, you know, 0 degrees and, you know, frozen pitch, he wouldn't be against playing the crossing game if the conditions favoured it. But as I say, he was a pragmatist in the true sense of the term. He believed strongly in defence first. The league title, the first league title they won under him, was built on the defence first and foremost. He talks in his book, he had a newspaper column which has been collected into a book called Herbert Chapman on Football, and he talks in there about how he likes having a tall centre half. And obviously we think of a centre half now as a centre back. At the time it was the middle midfielder in the 2-3-5 system that everyone played, and he would drop that centre half back in to basically become a third back. He didn't invent that had been around since the turn of the 20th century, but he was a big believer in it and used it to really good effect. The FA had actually reprimanded Huddersfield Town for their tactics in the 1922 FA Cup final, and they'd used Tom Wilson, who was the centre half, they'd used him, basically dropped him in to become a third back, to become what we would think of as a modern centre back, and that was seen as like a spoiling tactic. I believe the Examiner at the time even called him a great spoiler, and he ruined the game, and I don't think they particularly meant it as a compliment. There were sort of genuine innovations that he did think about how things worked on the ball. Town fans might laugh at this now, but his great innovation when he was at Northampton was he realised that you didn't have to pass forward all the time. You didn't have to stay constantly on the attack. If you were, you know, on the attack and getting nowhere and coming up against the defence, sometimes it paid to actually pass the ball backwards and draw the defence out so you could go again, which every side in the world does now, pretty much. But he was the first one in English football to realise that was a viable tactic.
I think the relationship between Clem and Herbert Chapman was a good one, because they'd first met up at Leeds in the First World War when players were guesting, and Herbert Chapman had got a few good players from Arsenal and places like that, and he got my granddad, and I think his brother George as well, and they did very well at Leeds, and I think when he came here, Herbert Chapman said, I know the guy to get in here to be the general, you know. And I think my granddad, when he became manager, I'm sure he'll have had talks with Herbert Chapman before Herbert died, and he'll have seen how he went about putting the team together, because he was very astute, was Chapman, in recognising good players and blending them into a good team. And my granddad will have seen that, because he was pretty smart about football, and I'm sure he took that into his managerial career.
I don't think any road to an FA Cup final's straightforward, ever. You know, whoever you play, you got to come up against some decent sides, and some sides who are as desperate as you are to win. You know, you just look at the history of the FA Cup and the games that we all remember. You know, Sunderland beating Leeds, of course, Hereford beating Newcastle. It's all, you know, plucky giant killers that come up with the goods on the day. So there's never an easy run to a cup final, and that one in 1921-22 really looks quite tricky to me. Lots of away games, certainly in the three first ties that Huddersfield went through. They obviously had to go to replays in each of them, so nothing came easy in that cup run. And they were also up against, you know, Burnley were the league champions, Blackburn Rovers were a really big, well-established club. Perhaps they got a little bit lucky with getting Millwall, certainly at home, and that proved to be the case, because they pretty much overpowered Millwall. But Town were on a roll by that stage. But yeah, I think it was quite a tough run to the FA Cup final, really.
Footballers are a superstitious lot, and it seems that was the case 100 years ago as much as it is now. In 1920, they had a genie lamp that they'd got from I believe it was the theatre in Leeds, had put on a production of Aladdin as a panto, and they'd got hold of the lamp and they used it as their lucky charm. They'd rub it before games on the cup run. I think because they were based in Leeds, they weren't terribly happy with that, so they got the lamp back. So then Town then got a stuffed donkey that they used throughout the following couple of seasons, and that sort of was sadly lost to fire after the semi-finals, I think it was in 22, when it mysteriously went up in flames. So obviously some kind of mishap going on there in the celebrations. The
FA Cup was the sort of premier, you know, sporting competition in the country at that time. It was a huge big competition, you know, that everybody wanted to have a part of. You just look at attendances for FA Cup matches as opposed to league games around about, well, even really up till the 1970s, you know, they were enormous. So there was so much interest in the FA Cup. It was such a big prize competition that, you know, no shortage of incentive to want to get to the final and want to win it. And having had that taste in 1920, I think a lot of the players who were still around, that was the bulk of the team really, you know, were fairly desperate to get there and try and do it again. One of the interesting things that doesn't often get mentioned is that Town played Preston just before the final and beat them 6-0. So yeah, I suppose you can look at that two ways. You know, it was a confidence booster, but also you're worried that Preston are desperate to get some revenge. And Preston were a big solid club. You know, they'd been a founder member of the Football League. That part of Lancashire was pretty much the sort of cradle of football with the Midlands and Sheffield. So they'd been around a long time, you know, a lot of power and some pretty good players. So I think Town would have been maybe quietly optimistic, but, you know, not overconfident. Well, everything that you read about that cup final is pretty grim, to be fair. It's certainly not a classic. Quite a sort of physical game, and obviously a physical game then would have been very physical by today's standards. So there was quite a lot of kicking, shoving, and pushing. Not a lot of football played from what you can see. I know that Town did have a good chance in the first half that Ernie Islip, who was a fairly reliable centre forward, missed. And it did look like it was a bit of a sort of arm wrestle really going into the second half. You know, it could have gone either way basically, and thankfully Town got that breakthrough when they needed it.
Both teams very tense and nervous, I would imagine, and the first real bit of quality during the game came from Billy Smith. It was his direct run which saw him get to the penalty area, and there were thoughts in the crowd that he would go on and score, but he was upended by one of the Preston defenders, and Billy Smith himself picked himself up and put the ball on the spot and took it right-footed, and the rest is history.
Having played on such a big stage and failed against Aston Villa, the Huddersfield Town squad members who were still in the team involved in Billy Smith's winner from the penalty spot must have felt such a sense of satisfaction, because for all the prestige and achievement sense of winning the FA Cup, it must have been just as devastating professionally and personally to get to the final and lose, as the Town team did against Aston Villa in 1920. They would have righted a lot of wrongs gnawing away inside them by winning at Stamford Bridge against Preston North End, I'm sure.
Yeah, one of the intriguing things, or the thing that always intrigues me about you know, those early days of FA Cup finals, is how people actually physically got to London to the game, what it cost them. So you've got to remember that it was a big outlay for the supporters that went down there. And there was obviously a good number of people from Huddersfield on special trains, specially organised trips, but lots of people had to keep tabs from Huddersfield. Which wasn't easy in those days. You know, you obviously didn't have anything like the communication that we have now. So lots of people gathered outside the Examiner office, for instance, in the town centre. The news kind of was relayed back that Town had won, and you know, spontaneous celebrations around the town centre, from what you can tell. On the day itself, I think there was I've read things about a special blue and white sort of shell, or kind of what you call a firework, I suppose, these days, being released by one of the local cinemas. So, you know, certainly an absolute festival air about the town centre. You know, the place was on the map, wasn't it? And everybody was, you know, delighted by the success of the club. Well, it's fascinating that the Town actually played the same night as they brought the cup back. And obviously everything was a bit slower in those days, so it took them a while to get back from London. They had quite a few celebrations down there. You know, I think they came back by train into Huddersfield railway station, and anybody who was there after the Premier League or getting promoted to the Premier League celebrations, that'll strike a chord with them, because it had been the same thing in 1922. So, you know, virtually the whole of the town seemed to be out in the streets. Various reports of, you know, up to 40,000 people, which, when you think about it, is pretty busy in Huddersfield town centre. The team came back in, obviously parading the trophy. They had a civic reception. I guess that would have been sort of early afternoon. No doubt had a few drinks, cup of tea and a slice of cake. And then everybody came down to Leeds Road for a match that night. Interestingly, Town, before the final, in run up to the final, had been still in danger of being relegated from the First Division, but that had eased somewhat, so that added to the euphoria of the whole occasion. And just to cap it all off, they beat Middlesbrough that night at Leeds Road, so what a fantastic day that must have been.
I think there's an argument that you wouldn't have Huddersfield Town as it is now without that FA Cup success. You know, you look at Bradford City, for instance, just up the road. They spent a lot of their existence in the third and fourth tiers, where Huddersfield have spent a lot of their existence in that second tier. And I think that the name that they gave themselves in the 20s really helped set out the stall for the decades that followed.
I think winning the FA Cup was really the sort of stepping stone to what was to come next. In lots of ways, because it gave the club some confidence. It was a sign that, you know, they'd arrived on the big stage. It was a huge achievement to win the FA Cup for a club so young and so relatively new to the First Division as well. And if you sort of track the progress that was made fairly soon after the FA Cup success, you know, everything was pointing in the right direction. You know, Town won the Charity Shield quite soon after. At that time was played at the end of the season. Beating Liverpool, that was another sign that things were going in the right direction. They finished third in the league the season after, and then of course came the absolute glory years of those triple title triumphs. So FA Cup was a major stepping stone to that.
That year, 1922, can never be taken away from us, from the club, from the town, because I think students, people who really understand football history, know that an FA Cup triumph in the final was so much more prestigious back in the day. And to have the club's name associated with the record books to that certain factual extent is actually very valuable still. However much this glorious place and this glorious team continues to move us, and however much it's part of my family fabric, our fabric across the town, I think all of us would agree that if ever the sporting spectacle became predictable, we'd all stop coming. You have to have the glory of the surprise and the emotional turmoil that we go through, good and bad. I think Town could win the FA Cup. Honestly, I don't think it would go down as big an achievement as the team from 1922, because life is different now. Priorities are very much different for a professional football team at the level of Huddersfield Town under Carlos Corberán and Dean Hoyle and his board. But there is no reason not to expect Huddersfield Town to have a real stab at winning the FA Cup or another big domestic trophy in the foreseeable future.
The relevance of that 1922 Cup for my family is that we're so proud because he was the first man in the 20th century to get 3 Cup winners' medals. The relevance to Town is still great because it's part of the history. And they've won the Cup. Would like to win it again at some point, but they've won the Cup. How many teams dream of getting to the final, never mind winning a Cup, and never happened? So the relevance is still there, even today.
The FA Cup win still resonates with me. We perhaps live in an era now whereby maybe a couple of people forget that football existed prior to 1992, and okay, maybe the magic of the FA Cup has diminished a little bit over the last couple of years. But for me, history isn't something you can just eradicate. We wear our history when we go to a game, when we pull on the shirt, when we talk about Huddersfield Town. History is something that makes the present. You know, it makes who we are, and what we strive and hope to achieve. And for me, the traditions of Huddersfield Town Football Club is something that I'm really proud of, and I hope that my children are always going to be proud of as well.
There's a team that is dear to its followers. The colours are bright blue and white. They're a team of renown, and they're the pride of the town. And the game of football is their delight. And all the while upon the field of play, thousands loudly cheer them on the way. Often you can hear them say, who can beat the town today? And then the bells will ring so merrily, and every goal shall be a memory. So Town, play up and bring that cup back to Huddersfield. So Town, play up and bring the cup back to Huddersfield.